This episode is brought to you by Smarty Pants Vitamins. Smarty Pants makes multivitamins for the whole family, including kids. In fact, their kids' multivitamins have 50% more nutrients than the leading kids' multigummy, and they're designed to support overall health. Shop now at smartypantsvitamins.com. 50% more nutrients claim is based on an IRI info scan of MULO sales and multigummies from March 2021 to March 2022. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
Welcome to the Big Suey, presented by DraftKings.
Why are you listening to this show?
The podcast that seems very similar to the other Dan Le Batard podcast.
I'm sorry, I'm not going to apologize for that.
In fact, the only difference seems to be this imaging.
I have been tempted in restaurants just walking past tables to grab somebody's fries that if they're just there. That hasn't happened to you guys?
I've done it.
And now, here's the marching man to nowhere, Fat Face, and the habitual liar.
Welcome to Meadowlarkers 40. Think different. The game, former MLB Players Association Executive Director Donald Fehr once told me, is not Red Sox-Yankees. It's owners versus players. Labor is the field upon which all professional sports are played. It determines who sets the rules, who is compensated and by how much, what's going to matter to the industry, and who sets the course for the future. In other words, who has the power. Over the course of the 20th century and now into the 21st, there has been upstart challenges to all of the world orders. Some, like free agency, were seismic. Other revolutions died before inception. Who can forget, famously, Chicago Bulls guard Craig Hodges trying to implore a Michael Jordan at the height of his powers to realize that Nike needed him more than he needed Nike. And by extension, that the NBA needed the players more than the players needed the NBA. What if the players created their own league? Is a romantic dream that has existed for decades. The Los Angeles Clippers' mild player revolt in 2014 led to the ouster of Donald Sterling as team owner. Then came the uprisings in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, in Baltimore following Freddie Gray's death in police custody in 2015, Colin Kaepernick taking a knee in 2016. During that time, the term player empowerment became a phrase that has existed ever since. In the following year, in 2017, I asked Carmelo Anthony if romance could ever become reality. Could NBA players form their own leagues? And he said, I think we could. But most players would have to be willing to take the risk of ownership. For most guys, it's just easier to sit back and have someone else pay you $12 million to play basketball and have them take the risk. Their billions will beat our millions every time. But in 2018, two entrepreneurs, Jonathan Soros, yes, of those Soroses, and John Patrickhoff saw an opportunity through the undervalued world of women's sports to remake sports, to base rosters and scoring rules along the lines of current models of fantasy sports, to swap teams and redraft every week as a tournament, all different sports, softball and volleyball. And here's the kicker. The players are the ones who run the show. The concept is called Athletes Unlimited. It's been around since 2020, and it could be a big piece of the future. I'm Howard Bryant. Kate Fagan and Amin El-Hassan are here, as is one of my favorite writers, Louisa Thomas of The New Yorker, to talk about Athletes Unlimited and something we hardly ever do in sports, reimagining the entire landscape. All right, everyone, we have Meadowlarkers 40 here, 40, yes. Number 40. And a special guest, my favorite writer from The New Yorker. And we could talk tennis all day, but we're not going to talk tennis. We're going to talk about empowerment. And we just did the intro. And Louise, I just want to jump out and just say, number one, it's a great story and a great idea, and one that everyone's been talking about for a long time, about what would happen if the players actually had power. Where did this idea come from, and how did it germinate for you to get where you ended up getting?
Well, it actually came through kind of an old school traditional way, which is that a publicist that I knew through tennis was working with Athletes Unlimited and was like, hey, there's this new league. I think this is something you might be interested in hearing more about. And I brushed him off a little bit, as one tends to do, but he sent over some material and I was like, wait a second, this actually seems new and interesting. Amazing. And we talked about it a little bit more, and as it launched, I kept an eye on it. And then it came up again because I was actually looking into a story about Sky Blue and NWSL team, which was undergoing a transformation, but was coming out of a really, really bad place. And it turned out that one of the co-founders of Athletes Unlimited, John Patrikoff, had actually looked into acquiring Sky Blue back in its kind of nadir. And I sort of started connecting the dots. And when I started talking to him, realized that he was actually coming at it kind of from the same place that I was coming at it from, which is, reading more about women's team sports and realizing how differently they were framed than men's team sports. That yes, there are a lot of major, major, major structural issues that women's sports face, and also, frankly, athletes face. But that one of them is the way we consider value. When you talk about, and it was partly because he was coming from the MLS, where teams had these really high valuations, even though they had, they had some strong things. They had good attendance figures and long, strong community ties and things like that, but they didn't have huge viewership on ESPN. They did not have a lot of the kind of traditional things that we associate with successful leagues. And yet these teams were valued these kind of astronomical numbers. Whereas the NWSL, which was featured players who were far more famous in the US, had tiny, tiny, tiny valuations. And, they were eating meals out of vending machines and not getting their medical bills paid and having ice baths and trash cans. And, and these are some of the most famous female athletes in the country. And he was like, wait, what's going on here? Like, what's going on? And also, what if we, like, seeing the women's sports space actually as a place to innovate, also, and saying that, you could spend a lot of money to get into a system that was pretty broken and try and fix it. Or you could take this opportunity as a chance to try something new. And he and another man, Jonathan Soros, decided to try something new.
Will you run us through the actual unique aspects of Athletes Unlimited? Can you kind of run us through 5 or 6 of the ways that differentiate their model from? Sure.
I mean, there are tons of ways. And I might actually have to refer to my notes because there are so many. And it's been a little while since I've been in the weeds with this year. But one of them is that they don't have a set number of teams with set rosters. The teams actually change constantly and they're redrafted. So they have these. Someone's a team captain and they're constantly redrafting, a number of players are team captains. They're constantly redrafting their teams and they're going out and playing. It's, team Larson versus, team whoever. And the leaderboards are, the leaderboard is not, which team is winning, but which player is winning, and players are accorded certain points for certain skills based on their position or whatever. So like in goalie, in lacrosse, a goalie is obviously not scored the same way as an attacker is scored. And yet the goalie and the attacker are still competing for the most valuable player, which has a cash prize, at the end. And everyone is guaranteed a base salary, but there are kind of bonuses laden upon those. But that's only like the start, because basically the idea is that the value of the league is in the players, and they're trying to make that a real thing. So on the kind of governance, the players are part of governance. There's always a player on the board. There's always players have phone calls, every single day, I think, actually, they check in. And it's not only like, we think this is not working out, we don't think this is working out. It's also, they're talking about the food and the showers and, the hotels and all the kind of like, quality of life things, and also like movie night, and also, diversity and equity issues. And so basically the overall idea is that investors cap their returns. So they can only make so much money. And then the rest of the money is going to go back to the athletes and nonprofit causes. I mean, it is not considered a like traditional for-profit league like any other league. Like we see, we've just watched the biggest trade in Major League Baseball history, right? They just like basically traded, what some people are saying could be like one of the greatest players of all time at age 23, Juan Soto, because the Washington Nationals like didn't want to pay him, because the team is for sale, because the model of a team, the economic model of the team doesn't like allow for that in their view. Basically the idea is that we're going to approach this team is a totally different way. It's not going to be a traditional business as we normally understand them. The money's going to flow back to the players, and players are going to be involved in every single consequential decision, ranging from maternity leave to food, to rules, to diversity issues, to philanthropic causes, and every player is empowered to make donations to a cause that they care about. I actually talked to one softball player for whom that was actually a huge issue, because remember, professional softball players don't have a lot of money, right? Like they're making, very, very, very small amount of money. They're coaching on the side. They don't have money to give away in the way that like a baseball player with their own foundation might be able to like pick their cause. And so being able to sort of like then, connect with the cause that matters and have someone put money into that is a meaningful thing to them. And they're sort of trying to reimagine it on basically on every level. And part of it is also, there's a production element to it. So they have their own, high-end social media, video production accounts that basically are involved in trying to like tell stories and create narratives around these things. And, they're streaming all the draft days. So the idea being like, you can participate and follow every single kind of element of what's going on. So yeah, it's a really kind of holistic rethinking of what team sports should look like.
Isn't it really sort of interesting when you're dealing with a underserved or undervalued space, whether it's women's sports or whether we're talking about wealth inequality, whatever it is, that there is the immediate reflex is to pour more resources into that broken system that is not serving you, does not help you, is not really where you want to be. And then you see some different opportunities here. Is there something there where we have been doing this all wrong, and that there is a space here where, and Kate and Amin and I on the show, we always talk about the inequalities with women's sports. And one of those areas is, just this thing that we're talking about. Maybe that model does not work for this, doesn't work in this space.
Louisa, I remember reading your NWSL article about Sky Blue and just being kind of blown away at even some of those anecdotes you just dropped about like the ice baths in the trash can and the inequities that I think we abstractly know in women's sports. When you put it to paper, you're like, wow. But I want to like broaden out to a question I've been thinking about after reading your Athletes Unlimited article on the New Yorker, which is that I was kind of thinking about how even in the earliest stages of COVID, as we started to build infrastructure around COVID, I was like, do we want to build infrastructure around this? Or because like, do we want, like at the time it was like, okay, well, let's build these lines at pharmacies that keep us away from one another. Let's build Zooms as our meetings. Obviously those things are now invaluable to the way we do work. But at the time I was like, I don't know that I want life to be that way and that we build infrastructure around it. And I'm using that example as like, I have this question of, okay, so we've had these insights that people follow individuals and not sports, and they're less about the city that they're from, and sports have changed. Do we want to build infrastructure around those insights? Like, are these good things to be baking into our sports world right now?
I think actually that's an excellent question, because a lot of what we love most about sports are pushing against that. I think that people really do continue to find value in rooting for their hometown team. I think people really do kind of care about continuity and teams and things like that. And I think that Athletes Unlimited is like very excited about its model. But I'm skeptical about, throwing away some of the things that I think are kind of cherished in sports. I think that one of the things that they would say is, first of all, there's room for both. They're not saying like, they're very adamant that their model will work with men's sports as well. And we can talk a little bit more about the idea of athlete empowerment and what it means and what it doesn't. But I think that they will also tell you, if you were even just looking at in the women's sports space, they're not saying, oh, the WNBA should not exist, right? They're offering an alternative. And actually, this is a good example because they have just had a season in the WNBA's long off season in which players traditionally go overseas. And we've now learned, some of the very serious pitfalls with that model too. They've offered a kind of, much, much, much lower financial opportunities, but still the chance to play at home, the chance to be a part of something kind of really exciting in which you are considered a full partner. And to sort of like do that as a kind of augmenting the WNBA season as opposed to, trying to replace it. So I think that there is possibly room for both. But also, I think that those are good questions. Like, do we want to sort of build infrastructure around the idea of branding? The sort of individual social media driven, that stuff kind of makes me queasy. I would prefer to like hide behind the team brand. But, when you think about that in those terms, like resources and money are going to flow toward the person who's controlling the team brand in that instance, which is not the individual athlete. Whereas in this model, at least, players are seeing the fruits of their labor. It's a challenge though. I think that they have huge ambitions. And I think that the fact that they're still around and signing multi-year deals and things like that is a really promising thing. But I think some of these questions are still open questions.
Yeah. Hey, I mean, when you're going, aren't we already moving in this direction anyway? I mean, when you're looking at whether we're talking about the super team model in the NBA, what is that? The team doesn't really matter anymore. When we're talking about some of these different movements, it's not being stated the way Athletes Unlimited sort of states it, and it doesn't have the sort of arcade type of feel when you're looking at the scoring. I remember when I was reading your story, when I read it last year, when I was reading, and I was like, wait a minute, I read this story already. And so I remember reading this anew last week and prepping for this. I'm still confused by your first two paragraphs, and I'd already read the story. I'm like, wait a minute, I'm like, okay, this is like fantasy sports. And how different is that? I mean, I was going to say, go take this, but how different is that when you do try to tweak things? Like we saw it with the XFL a little bit. You see it with some of these other, it feels a little gimmicky or maybe not. But then again, as gimmicky as it feels, there's a runner on second base now in professional baseball in extra innings.
Howard, now, here's the thing. I didn't read it and think, oh, this is too gimmicky. What I thought about was in a lot of team sports, already we have problems with players who are driven or infatuated by individual accomplishments, right? The guy who wants that one extra rebound so he can average 10 a game, right? The player who...
and have his contract incentive kick in, too.
Right. Yeah, the player who demands to rush the ball more because he's got something, if he hits certain carries or whatever. But at least it's kind of an ulterior motive, which is secondary to presumably winning. When you make it so blatantly part of the scoring system that this isn't just for fantasy players and it isn't just for guys who are trying to hit incentives and bonuses and stuff, this is the point of the game. There has to be internal conflict to that. I can't imagine there not being. And that was the biggest, honestly, Louisa, the biggest surprise of the story when you said there was a player that was skeptical, but when she got there, everything was fine. I was like, I don't know if everything can be fine in a system like that.
Well, a couple things. One is that in the scoring system, you get the most points for winning. So you are incentivized in the individual scoring system, the leaderboard system, you are incentivized to try to win the game first, not to hit a double in softball or whatever. So that is the first thing. But I think that one of the things they're trying to do is create a culture in which there is a sense of collaboration and cooperation across teams, that players are, it's a little bit more, I mean, it sounds Pollyannish, and maybe that is naive to accept that this is the way it is. But enough players said to me, actually, like I was super skeptical, and then I loved it because there is a sense of everybody's a teammate with each other because they're working toward, and partly this has to do with the newness of the league and the high stakes about it working out. But there's a kind of sense of, kind of like euphoric cooperation in the whole kind of enterprise, and the fact that they are all considered teammates in the league as opposed to not just teammates in the, whatever individual team they're on. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely like a lot of things where I'm like, if I were an athlete, if I were an elite professional athlete, would I want to also, if I'm then elected captain, like, would I want to spend all my time being general manager too? Like, isn't that sound exhausting? I mean, I don't know. I just had COVID, and I had a friend send over some meals, And she did something like, pro tip, she picked everything for me. Like the meal just arrived at my house and it was the nicest gift that anyone has ever gotten me. Like I realized that so much of what is exhausting is just like making decisions all day long, fatigue. Right? And if you're an athlete and you have to not only like go out and perform your, do your job, but then on top of it, decide like, try to like negotiate interpersonal chemistry and things like that. Like that might sound like fun in theory, but it also just sounds completely exhausting and like not for me. And so I think that there are people who thrive with more responsibility, but there's certainly people for whom that sounds terrible and totally counterproductive. And so building that into the system also sounds like maybe great for some, maybe not great for others. They do have a sort of like infrastructure around that where people have help, but still, the point is it's different and it calls upon a different kind of outlook and skill set and things like that. But I do think that the larger point is that there is teamwork involved. There is a kind of sort of sense that winning is the most important thing. It's just that it still looks different than everything else.
Well, the scoring model reminds me of, did you ever play in the Wimbledon tournament, Louisa? Do you play tennis?
I do play tennis.
Did you ever play?
I never did play in the Wimbledon. I
never played?
I got to hit on the grass once, but yeah, I never played.
Well, Wimbledon back in the day, they got rid of it last year or this year, but there's no more middle Sunday. Every year, Sunday was an off day throughout the tournament. And so on Sunday, there was a media tournament on one of the public parks where everybody played. And you entered and you played and you switched teams and everybody sort of rotated teams. And it's essentially like wins above replacement, like in baseball. So because everybody switched teams, what individual player had the most points, they won the tournament. I came in third one year. I got a Djokovic signed ball. And it's actually sort of interesting because even though you're on a team, you are playing for yourself. So it's like if my team wins in doubles, I get 3 points for this. And then you move over to another team and your team wins that one. And now you've got 6 points. And so now you're like, it's like, hey, I'm the most valuable player. My team keeps winning, even though maybe I have nothing to do with it, but it's actually kind of cool. It is an interesting reimagining of it. I mean, I can see the wheels turning.
He's got thoughts happening.
Because I'm thinking about it. Tennis, obviously, is a sport, even in doubles, is a very highly individualistic sport. Softball, like baseball, is a highly individualistic sport. It's a series of one-on-one interactions for the most part. I'm just wondering whether the concept would translate to a sport like soccer or basketball, where it is a lot more team and you kind of rely on some people to do some things and some people to do other things, and these things all add up to a win, but only some of them are actually tabulated and others aren't. Others are kind of like the intangibles.
I think volleyball counts, doesn't it? I mean,
volleyball, yeah, that's true.
I mean, but I also think that, one of the things you're thinking about is you are thinking about the traditional model where like an NBA team comes together, plays together all season. A lot of these women's athletes also are kind of used to having to drop in and play, with a strange group of people and then drop back out because, if we're thinking about, let's say basketball, they play with their WNBA team, then they go abroad and they play, maybe they're playing with USA basketball. They're not getting to spend a lot of time, except maybe with their club team in Europe or, China or Russia or wherever. They're not actually getting to spend a lot of time playing with any one group of people and developing those kind of relationships that you might think, or, I think that they're sort of maybe a little bit more used to being vagabonds, athletic vagabonds. And I also think that I think that's valid. I mean, I think that there are big questions about, how much do we price chemistry? And I mean, we saw this with USA basketball, men's basketball this summer. Like, they were not playing like a team for a long time. It took a while, but they got there. I mean, I think that you have to sort of say like, well, these people are professionals and they're going to figure it out, or not, and then they'll be the teams that won't win. And that will actually play into their individual results because they won't get those winning.
Sugats here for my friends over at Simply Safe. Around here, we talk a lot about the importance of good defense on the field or court. But what about defending your own home turf? Pretty important, huh? We believe home should be the safest place on earth for every family, which is why I use and recommend Simply Safe Home Security. Simply Safe is advanced whole home security that puts you, your home, and your family's safety first. Here's why I love it. Easy to install. If I can do it, anyone can do it. And I love to be able to keep an eye on my driveway to see what packages are coming up, keep an eye, see when the kids get home, when I'm away. I love Simply Safe. It is amazing. Simply Safe offers comprehensive protection, not only against intruders and burglary, but against expensive home hazards from flooding to fires with 24/7 professional monitoring. Simply Safe's agents take action the moment a threat is detected. You can customize the perfect system for your home in just a few minutes at simplysafe.com/DLB. Go today and claim a free indoor security camera plus 20% off with interactive monitoring. Again, that's simplysafe.com/DLB.
I want to zoom out a little bit, and I have a question. I get, it's going to sound naive, but women's college softball, immensely popular. Women's college basketball, immensely popular. Women's college volleyball, immensely popular. Why? What is wrong with America where, as soon as you get that diploma, we don't care anymore? Because it'd be one thing for people to say, well, people don't care about women's sports, right? That's the usual kind of refrain. Right? Oh, no one wants to watch it because it's boring. But clearly, it's not boring when they play for Tennessee or Duke or Nebraska. What has anyone ever kind of identified what is the gap between why college sports can be so popular in a specific sport, but there be literally no appetite on the professional side?
Well, I think some of what Kate said is germane here. I mean, at the start, actually, people still do care about teams. Like, people care about where they went to college, right? They care about, those local ties. They care about going to games. They care about, picking a team and following it for 20 years, and then introducing it to their sons and daughters. But I think that is also a big question, which is why they've done this, because they said, like, look, there's obviously a market for them. There's obviously an appetite for these sports. Why can't we continue and tap into that excitement? And part of it is that it's hard. It's really hard to build, a league from the ground up. It's really hard to have the money and resources to pay players in a way that, makes it possible, let alone desirable, for them to keep playing. But yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, and I think we're only starting to see what the sort of ramifications of realizing that, college women's sports are popular, because we're only getting to see, what happens when they start having media days. And volleyball just had its first media day ever, so maybe there will be more of a kind of, a framework and infrastructure for, building these leagues. But yeah, I mean, it's like any other thing, though. These sports have to compete with attention for everything else, and part of the answer may be that there already are these exciting college teams and leagues, and the people who love softball get what they need, get what they want. They don't actually want or need a professional league, because they've got what they want. They don't need anything else.
No, isn't it also a question of tradition? I mean, I think that one of the things that we don't do nearly well enough is have the type of perspective that you have to understand how long it takes to actually build something. Wimbledon has been around since 1877. And so the Major League Baseball has been played since 1869. So when you're starting, the American League started in 1901. So of course you have an attachment to these things. They're all you know. It's all you know. It's all your grandfather knows. It's all your father knows. It's all your mother knows. It's everything. And it's like, what I really appreciate about this conversation is we are in a period of experimentation. Look at what's happening with the Live Golf, despite its odious politics and the rest of it. What are they doing? They're trying to say that, hey, this individual, are you going to watch Phil Mickelson for Phil Mickelson, or do you have to tie Phil Mickelson to the PGA championships or the Masters? why are we here? And I think that this is one of the arguments that you've constantly heard when basketball players were talking about maybe we could form our own league. And what are you watching? Are you here to watch the Los Angeles Lakers and the Boston Celtics, or are you here to watch LeBron James? I mean, these are the constant conversations taking place. And I think what is interesting about this story is there's an idea that, well, wait a minute, let's test this out as a business model. Let's find out. And do we want those answers? I mean, I think that you're seeing it in basketball more than any other sport right now as well, that the teams are in a real battle of being diminished. That, and you saw that in the 80s. It used to be Celtics Lakers, and then suddenly it was, it was Jordan versus Shaq in the advertising. So there's a constant recognition of player versus team.
But the resources still lie with the teams. I mean,
100%.
We can talk all day long about, whether or not people care about players versus teams, but one side is writing the checks and the other side is receiving them. And ultimately one side has the lion's share of power and the other side is fighting for more. And one of the things that's interesting about this model is it's sort of like saying, can we do that differently too? Not just can we exploit, a kind of shifting media landscape and things like that, but can we rethink our kind of core assumptions when it comes to what that piece of it empowered.
That piece of it I thought was really interesting too, because what is the key to any fledgling deal? Where's your revenue stream? Do you have a TV deal? And in this venture, they actually have streaming relationships. So the possibility of revenue stream is actually there.
Yeah, I mean, it is, but at the same time, the money is small. We're not even talking about WNBA salaries. We're not talking about even WNSL salaries. Sorry, I'm garbling my my letters, but the point is, we're talking about the tens of thousands, not the hundreds of thousands, let alone millions. And part of what's hard here is that any kind of new venture, you need to, unless you're golf, I guess, you need to swallow the possibility that you're going to take a risk and you're going to make less money at the start. And hopefully you're going to grow interest and the money will grow with it. But that's hard for people to do. I mean, as you mentioned in your intro, Howard, like it's much easier to just take the check, right? It's always going to be easier to take the check. But I think one of the things that's exciting about Athletes Unlimited is they're finding that, there are other reasons to do things. And one of the reasons why, I think that some of these athletes are coming in and are finding that they're excited, even though they don't, might be skeptical in the beginning, is that there is a kind of a sense of mission. I mean, you find that across women's sports. I mean, there is a kind of like greater willingness to embrace the idea that you're playing for something, not just yourself and not just for winning. And part of this conversation actually that we've been sort of skirting around is like, how important is winning? Like, what does winning mean? And, what kind of value we should place on it, both as fans and as athletes, and what does it even mean to win? I'm a huge believer in like luck and contingency and winning, and how random it can be sometimes.
So you're not watching The Captain then, where Derek Jeter constantly says, if we don't win a championship, the entire season is a failure.
Exactly. So I think that's also an interesting part of, how we think about sports. But yeah, I mean, I think that there's real value in kind of like challenging this idea of player empowerment and saying like, are we going to talk about this superficially? Or are we going to talk about it meaningfully and trying something?
And it's something that we really didn't talk about, and that is women's sports in particular, which is how fertile a ground is this when you're looking at, I think I kind of love the fact that your story also still sort of spoke in like Moneyball terms when you're talking about value and undervalue and recognizing assets that are, not quite being looked at, and that there's an opportunity there. I saw some uncomfortable capitalism in there as well. That, hey, there's
this is the world that we live in, right?
Right. There's money to be made in this.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you what you thought, and you were getting to it, the uniqueness of women's sports that could make this work.
Well, one is, I think, and I don't want to get into the question of I don't want to like overly gender this, to say like, well, women just like working together and men are, all alphas and just want to like beat each other or something like that. But there is, I think, because of the way sports have traditionally been structured, I think that the women are, willing to sort of think collaboratively and try something new in a way that, someone who's being offered huge check to do the same old thing might not be willing for, obvious reasons. And I do think that, I think part of, I have in the piece, but basically the bar for entry is so much lower in women's sports. Like you can do this, like it, to start a new WNBA, to start a new NBA, like to start a new players based league would just take an unbelievable amount of resources. And it would take an unbelievable, amount of compromising on the part of players to sort of not say like, I want what's mine from the start. Right. Whereas in women's sports, you can take like, the starting rookie salary and kind of make a huge impact from the start. Basically what's like pennies in men's sports, and sort of do something very real in women's sports. And I think that, I was right. Like, I think that there are these kind of obviously built-in audiences that if you can tap into, there's a space to do that. But yeah, I do also think there's a little bit of a culture thing. Like, I think that the women's sports are more comfortable with embracing a mission, and that's true, obviously, in the WNBA. It's true in it's true in women's soccer, obviously, in the fight for pay equality. It's been true in tennis ever since Billie Jean King, walked into, a group of women and said, let's burn it all down and start it all over. And so I think that there's you talk about tradition, there's actually a tradition of innovation in women's sports.
Yeah, I think about how even the WNBA is still the place where they experiment with different playoff formats, or the 4-point line during the WNBA All-Star game. Like it's like a double-edged sword, because you know that women's sports wants to be given certain opportunities and they're willing to do things differently just to have the opportunity. But then on the other hand, you see that like, the stakes aren't as high, and that's why we can experiment. So You're kind of like balancing both of those. But Louisa, one of the things that I've found fascinating about all of Athletes Unlimited was looking at it through someone who has told stories about sports for years, and asking myself how a model like this shifts the storytelling you would do around sports. It's like, because some of what's baked into the Athletes Unlimited model is like very nostalgic at its core. Anybody who played on the playground and was the captain and got to pick their team can feel what it might be like to have the most points and then be in charge of picking your team. Right. And then you're like, and I love, like, so I can like intuit baked into it is you're not necessarily picking the best player. Right. You're picking the player who you vibe with, right? And that matters in sports in a way that only players might know intrinsically, versus a general manager trying to architect the perfect squad. So there's like this combination of both nostalgic, very grounded sports that we can all feel, but then also experimentation that might not make a whole lot of sense to us. Right. And so when you look at it as like, I wouldn't, right now what we're doing around this model is storytelling about the model. Right. But we don't yet know, like, how will we storytell around this sports model if in a generation it actually succeeds and flourishes? Like, how do you think about like what the storytelling around it is? I think that's actually a really good point, and I hadn't quite thought about that. But yeah, right now the story is the model. It's not sports, right. Yeah. But, I think the idea is that the more these people get, the more we're watching, the more we're going to be introduced to these names, and the more continuity there is, maybe not around teams, but around players and around the whole kind of league, the more interesting individual players will be. And I think that, Athletes Unlimited has correctly identified the fact that narrative is like the huge driver of interest in sports. And, that's why they are putting so much money into production value in terms of
and this is also where some of the women's leagues have failed. Like, I mean, if you have been a women's soccer fan trying to watch, your random, I don't know, Washington Spirit game can be like completely frustrating exercise because the camera is crappy, the feed is bad, like the, announcers are maybe not, all you want them to be. And it can be like, this is just like, Bush League stuff. Like, it's just not a good look. And they are really trying to make it seem as professional as possible. And about telling their own stories. I'm somewhat also suspect of that. Like, as a writer, I don't want to be like force fed, basically propaganda, which, and I think that there's a little bit of like, women's sports also does like lend itself to like feel good stories and like control around. I mean, this is actually, I'm actually taking a bit of a tangent here, but this is a real challenge, I think, in women's sports, is that there is so much kind of like, a desire to succeed and feel good stuff. And also a kind of like desire that, the players do have what power they can, that there is a kind of like anxiety around letting other people tell their stories. Athletes Unlimited like has its own channel and is trying to put out a lot of great stories, and there are other groups like, other media organizations like Together. And I mean, the men's model is doing this too, Uninterrupted, everything like that. But there is a sort of kind of like desire to sort of like tell the best possible version of any given story. And, what happens once there is more kind of overall interest and other people sort of start looking at these stories and they become more complicated is the kind of the question I'm going to be interested in seeing. But yeah, I mean, I don't really know, I guess, is the answer. But I also think it's like the same as any other thing. I mean, we've seen that the Olympics is hugely successful, right? Even though you're not following, your random track and field star, you can immediately get interested and plugged in and then plug back out. And it doesn't seem to diminish your enjoyment of it. So I think that there's not like an inherent problem with the idea that, we don't have these sort of like more continuity in terms of narrative and things like that. I think people are perfectly willing to, have a crash course introduction and then forget who someone is and still think that they come away, having had a great time.
That's the tradition they're following there is rooting for Team USA.
This country.
Right? Yeah. That's the team.
That's a good point.
That's their Pittsburgh Steelers or their.
That's a very good point. Yeah, I don't have an answer for that.
But I do think that there's like, in terms of the storytelling about something like this, we've seen shades of it in the NBA now that you have the certain players are the captains of the All-Star game being picked, and then that's broadcast.
You're picking your friends.
Yeah, like if Athletes Unlimited can figure out a way to properly broadcast, and I know they do this on like Zoom and stuff, these drafts every week, and you really do understand the dynamics between somebody not picking a certain player they thought they were going to pick, and you're really following that. Again, but then there's that question of like, is this the sports content we want?
No, it's totally true.
Right?
Do we want to turn like internet message boards into actual sports?
Right.
It's a good question. I personally like hate personal branding. Like, I think it's like, I am sort of like not millennial enough to,
because I think we're both bad
I think it's all selling out, So it's like,
well, but that really is, I mean, where we're at right now in terms of trying to figure out what this new world is going to look like. And as we let you go, Louisa, we're going to stay on for a couple more minutes, I think. But I do want to say thank you so much for doing this. And it really does bring the question of how much do we watch these athletes against how much we're into the traditional, am I watching football if it's not the Pittsburgh Steelers? Am I really here just to see the talent?
I'm gonna just interject to say one thing. Like, I actually, for me personally, the Athletes Unlimited sport that has been most successful is volleyball, because I have never watched volleyball before, and it turns out that it is like a fantastic watch. Like, it is so athletic, it's so fun. I have no idea how the scoring works, but I didn't know how the scoring works in the first place. Like, I had no kind of like baseline, and I think that there is something like, if you kind of approach it with that attitude, it's a little bit different than if you're going into it looking to say like, well, I am not just a Yankees fan, but a Sooners fan or something like that. It's going to be a different experience than if you're like, hey, this looks like something fun and wacky, like, let's do it.
Thanks, Louisa.
Well, thank you. Come again.
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Please.
What'd you think, Kate? Final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, well, I love Louisa's writing and like the insight, and I think it's like listeners who maybe hadn't heard of Athletes Unlimited. I think regardless, this obviously happens to be about women's sports because, as Louisa explained, the barrier to entry and the experimentation is just more accessible in women's sports. But the broader question that I think we're trying to ask is all of the things that the first 39 Meadowlarkers seem to always be touching on was, what is this sports model that is shifting? The ground is shifting beneath our feet. What will it look like in the future as we're talking about player empowerment and capitalism, this branding and the move from cities and teams to singular stars? All of that is baked into the Athletes Unlimited 100%. Model. And so I think that's kind of the bigger question is like, give it a look, really see if like the things that we think we're heading toward, like, is that the sports landscape that we want to see in the future, or does it not matter if we want it, right? That's just the way our world has shifted.
That's right. Well, just imagine if you had an unfortunate or interesting co-opting of a men's team getting involved in just trying it for a summer or something. And I think it's a great question. If you had, I don't know if it's really not that different from baseball barnstorming in the offseason when they used to do that. You just take the teams, you swap them up, you move from city to city, and you play. And we really would find out what our viewing appetite is. Are we here for the talent, or are we here for the tradition, or some combination of the two? And I think you're seeing it with the Live Golf tournament as well, where it's like, are you watching the Masters, or are you watching the player?
And just quickly, I think there's one other thing that we have touched on, and we have glanced off it when it comes to the Olympics in terms of the differentiation in this Athletes Unlimited model too, is singular locations or short bursts of time. And you see that model with the College World Series and college softball. And there's a question to ask in that, which is, yes, you're saving money on travel, but also, can you build infrastructure around this event that looks like a festival, kind of, right? Like,
people like watching tournaments.
Yes, they love that. They love, I know every May I can go to Chicago, Athletes Unlimited, and it's like the grounding of like, I'm going to go spend a week there, and I'm going to be able to catch some hoops. Maybe they pair it with concerts. Like, there's a whole reimagining of what this could look like.
It's like Coachella or something, or it becomes a vacation. We're going to go do this and then check all this out. It's not that different from the sort of, I think the festivals are a really good comp, and it could be a lot of fun. I mean, I actually think I'm really sort of interested in seeing where this goes. And I hadn't even heard of it until I read that story. So something to follow. And congratulations on 40 Meadowlarkers.
I know. I was like, well, we kind of did a nice little episode here where we touched on a lot of themes that we have been talking about. And it got me thinking, I mean, it's a long way in the future, but I mean, episode 100 is going to be a big one. What are we going to bring?
Episode 50.
Yeah, we're going to have to,
well, and on that
start brainstorming.
Exactly. Amin Hassan has already left. Louisa Thomas has already left. Kate Fagan remains, and I remain. We will see you next week.